I'm delighted to welcome you to our alumni panel about how to interview online. Our panelists will introduce themselves shortly, but I'll start off with an intro to our moderator for today's session, Michael Case. Michael is a father to 3 daughters and is currently an executive search consultant focused on retained search for people and talent leaders in Series A to E venture-backed startups. He's also an executive coach specializing in empowering leaders from or based in East Asia to navigate the complex realities of the Silicon Valley culture. He was formerly VP of recruiting and an executive team member at Instacart, recruiting director at Uber and Salesforce, and ran an executive search for Apple Japan. He also launched, built, and exited from a 35-person recruiting firm in Tokyo. Michael holds his bachelor's in East Asian literature and civilization from the University of Chicago and an MBA from Chicago Booth, and speaks Chinese and Japanese. He received his coaching training at Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. And so that is certainly enough from me. I want to turn it over to Michael and our other 3 fabulous panelists on the line.
Well, thank you for that. If you're here on this call, you're probably thinking about getting a job or going through that process, and it's probably a good time to remind ourselves that it's super hard. Like finding a job, getting a job, like you only do it a few times in your life, more lately, but it's hard. So we're just going to try to share some ideas that we've talked about as a group. We're not experts, but we've gone through it. So we're happy to help share a little bit. And I'd love to introduce my fellow panelists. I'm just going to go on the screen here. Start with Marge. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Hi, I'm Marjang. I graduated from Booth with an MBA in '96, and I've spent about 20 or so years in technology marketing here in the Silicon Valley. I've worked with various Fortune 500 companies, Global 500, and also a number of startups. I'm also a coactive trained coach, and I help new grads and mid-career professionals break into or transition into tech marketing careers, just basically helping them develop effective marketing strategies. I've pretty much lived in the Zoom world for the last 2 years, even pre-pandemic. So happy to share what insights I have on interviewing from either side of the table and also just working in the Zoom world.
Marge, what's a coactive coach?
Oh, Coactive is, it's a Coactive Training Institute. That's actually, they focus on a different type of approach. It's basically you're designing a coaching plan with the client. It's a much more interactive, dynamic approach to coaching.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
And Liz, I see you had some Phil's coffee, so you must be in the Bay Area.
Yes, that is correct. Though they also have locations in Chicago now, which is great. My name is Liz Denup. I graduated from the college in 2014 with a degree in sociology. I'm an early career software engineer. For the past few years, I've been working in the technology industry, first in Chicago, where I worked at an academic publishing startup founded by U of C alum. And now in San Francisco, I joined a Series C startup during the pandemic, focusing on remote physical therapy mediated via sensors. Thank you for having me here.
I worked for the University of Chicago Press in the 90s as an undergrad. So
very nice.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. Michael, we talked earlier. I thought you were in a cafe, but actually this is your home office.
That's correct. I'm Michael Stone. I'm a 1996 graduate of the law school, a 1991 undergraduate of Harvard University. I've had a varied career working at large firms, small firms, about a decade and a half in the public sector. Currently, I'm the legal director for the Center for Disability and Elder Law, which is a 36-year plus organization that provides free legal aid to seniors, low-income seniors, and persons with disabilities.
Wow. I have to ask, Michael, was Barack Obama teaching when you were there?
When I was there, he was teaching a seminar, and UFC has a very small faculty, small student body as well. So he was definitely well known when I was there.
I was a bartender at the pub at Illinois, and I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure I served him beer. Great. So let's get into it. And this is a question for anyone. What's so hard about interviewing on Zoom?
I'll start. I think everything's hard about interviewing on Zoom. I know I'm a person who I do best when I connect with individuals. And part of that connection is reacting to body language, the environment that I'm in, everything. And all the cues are taken away from when you're interviewing on Zoom, and it becomes very hard. Everything from maintaining eye contact, where's the eye contact? So it's a tough situation. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's funny. So my eyes, I wear reading glasses now because I'm of a certain age, but they just, even on Zoom, like it doesn't work. Like it gets a little bit weird with my eyes. So yeah, that's for sure. Marja, Liz, any thoughts from you?
I agree with everything Michael noted that is difficult about Zoom. Also, having studied sociology, I think a lot of things like conversational turn taking are harder, especially in a group context on Zoom. It's not always clear where pauses in the conversation will be. And a lot of us are working from home for the first time or interviewing from home and like accepting the challenges and the chaos that comes with that. So like, it is hard. So, just recognizing that obstacle, I think, is a part of interviewing successfully.
And Liz, you actually went through this process during and Michael did as well, but you went through this process during the pandemic. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, definitely. So I moved to San Francisco 10 days before the lockdown came into effect in San Francisco, which was a weird time to move. And during this time, I interviewed at small 2-person startups. I interviewed at giant tech monoliths and everything in between. So, I got a lot of practice doing this, and like it takes a little bit of work to really nail down your routine, but it is very masterable and kind of gameable like any other skill.
That's a super good point. Like it's a skill, you work on it, you build on it. Marge, when we talked last week, you mentioned some possible issues with your preparation or your backgrounds or things like that. I don't know if you want to jump into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's hard, especially in our kind of pandemic world where things are going on in the background. You've got life going on. And just trying to account for that while you're interviewing is how do you adjust for that. And also one of the things I wanted to mention that's difficult about Zoom is cultural aspects of a company you're interviewing with. You don't get a sense for that when you're interviewing on Zoom as much. So there's a little bit more prep that you need to do to get a feel for what a company culture might be. It's different from walking into an office. Like if it's a startup, you kind of get a feel for the vibe in the office. You don't get that when you're on Zoom. So there's a little bit more preparation, maybe a little bit more networking that you need to do in advance. I can talk more about that later.
And you said you have a husband and a dog in the background somewhere. Is that right?
No, that was, I just have a lot going on in my background as well. I think that was Sam, but yeah, there's always distractions going on for me as well. So there's noises and whatnot, construction.
Yeah, and bandwidth issues. I have 2 kids in middle school and high school right now on Zoom. They're like, if my bandwidth goes out, that's the reason, right? Yeah. I think what you mentioned is important. There's some basics we should talk about, right? Like interviewing is hard to begin with. Now we're interviewing on Zoom. Like, what are some of the like really basics you can think about, like just showing up right on camera?
I would say number one is knowing where the camera is. The camera is not the same on every computer. Sometimes it's to the left or to the right. And if you spend your time looking at the actual video, you're not making eye contact with the camera. And that can communicate something that perhaps you don't want to communicate to your interviewer.
I've self-consciously now looking at my camera because you mentioned that. I'm like, I want to look right into it to be in the right space, but totally true, right?
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I agree with what Michael has noted. And I also want to call out, like, there's technical issues that can happen with interviewing on Zoom. So one recommendation I have is if you're a little bit nervous, to partner with a friend or a trusted colleague. I know software engineers have services where they pair, and I did probably a dozen mock interviews to get ready for like my real interviews. So if you have the time or if you are nervous, it can make the actual interviewing experience feel a lot more routinized and calm, I think.
Wow, you really prepared. How did you come up with that strategy?
I don't know if this is a Bay Area thing. Also, one time I read an article about Tony Romo and how he would watch like game footage to prepare for games. So I was like, that's a great idea. Maybe I should do that in a lot of areas of my life. Your mileage may vary with that, but it's very common in technology. I'm not sure if it's common in other industries. Michael can speak more to that in the legal industry, but it definitely, for me, I think like interviewing can be anxiety provoking. So I wanted to do a run through so that like I wouldn't have any nerves on the day of.
That's fantastic. I have interviewed literally thousands of people, and most of them don't do that. So it's great that you did that and prepared and thought about it. Marge, when we talked a few weeks ago, you had some even more practical ideas about like just showing up right on screen.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's, I like to think about it as very much dressing for an interview as you would in person. A lot of it is pretty much the same. Dressing head to toe is important, just kind of from mentally, it makes you feel a little bit more professional and more together. Also, you never know what's going to happen. Like I said, life happens on top of that. You don't want to get up and answer the bell with your shorts on. So there's little things like that could happen that might catch you off guard. So you want to make sure you're just as prepared, and just having your setup, besides testing all your the technology in advance, having everything you need nearby, like water, cough drops, whatever it is, just to help you feel a little bit more relaxed and at ease and make you feel more prepared as well.
Great thoughts. I mean, they always tell people when they train people in call centers, they train them to smile when they're on the phone, even though they're only on the phone. So it's an important idea, right? We have a lot of questions coming in around body language. How do you gauge interviewers' body language if they're not looking at the camera? Eye contact is important, but how can you observe the interviewer and be looking at them at the same time? How do you build trust online? Any ideas there?
I would start out by saying that I think, at least in my industry, this is not only new for the interviewee, but it's new for the interviewer. So I think that there is a lot of leeway and forgiveness, particularly now and at the beginning of the pandemic, that people have built in, that people understand that it's different than what they're used to doing. And there is an extension of a willingness to be more trustful and understanding. As Marge said, life happens sometimes. I've been in interviews where something happened and we laughed it off and we continued. But I think the most important thing is that how it impacts you. If if something happens and it makes you completely nervous and you blow the rest of the interview, then you want to make sure that you've anticipated to make sure things don't happen and prevent you from having, a good interview overall.
And Michael, you went through this during the pandemic, right?
Yes. In a sort of weird series of events, I was volunteering and seeking to increase to do more pro bono with the organization that I'm currently with. And those conversations eventually turned into, well, why don't you interview for a job here as well? So I interviewed in a series of interviews. So, and I got the pleasure of not only doing one-on-one interviews, but group interviews on Zoom, which is entirely new concept and experience for me. And then it ended up finally with a interview in a park, so that we could be socially distanced and yet have an interview experience.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I was super surprised when we talked about it, because in San Francisco, like, people are just not even going that close, right? So it was interesting in Chicago that you had an interview in the park. I don't know what they would do in the coming months, though.
Yeah, so it was June. So it now is different than what it was back in June. But people are still doing limited. I've heard of people doing interviews in airport hangars, wide open spaces, armories, big spaces, so that people can be distanced or have that feeling of distance still going on.
We've got a couple of interesting questions coming in. We had sort of a plan for this, but we're most interested as a group to help what the audience wants to hear. And Liz, there's a pretty tough one. If you're willing to answer it, someone asked about piercings, and she's got a piercing. She or Thea, I'm not sure. And she's been working in the nonprofit world, and that seemed okay. And she just wondered just how you dealt with that.
Yeah, definitely. I anticipate this question frequently, and I've already defended this choice to my grandmother. So
that's the hardest one, right?
Yeah, I'm ready to answer this here. Obviously, it varies, like, based on industry. I'm not sure if investment bankers or certain kinds of law firms would be accepting of this. I don't know. I haven't worked in those industries. I think that if being your whole self is important to you at work, a piercing or a tattoo can be a filtering mechanism. If I interviewed somewhere and they were like, you're not going to fit in here because of the way you look or other things about you, it wouldn't be a good fit for me, and I wouldn't enjoy working there. So if you feel comfortable and your industry permits it, it can be a useful filtering mechanism, I would say.
Can I jump in here? We actually do have attorneys with piercings.
Nice.
And you are an attorney, right?
And I am an attorney. I don't personally have piercings, but we do have them, as well as interns.
Great to know.
So, and it really goes back to Marge's point. What is the culture of the place that you're interviewing, and how comfortable do you feel in that culture?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's something I hadn't thought about. I guess I'm just pretty used to people with piercings and tattoos and NSF. So, and I have a couple bad tattoos that I would like to have removed, but unfortunately that's a pretty hard process. Wow. Let me go back to our list of questions. I think there were some preparations. There was a question in the chat around just actually showing up to the interview. I think she mentioned that she tends to talk faster and tries to fill the space instead of just answering. Any ideas on how to, when someone asks you a question, how to actually respond?
I think it goes back to that body language issue. I mean, usually if you're talking too fast, you will see someone react, and then you'll know, gee, something's not coming across well, so I should slow down. Most Zooms are showing, shoulders up, so you're not seeing the rest of the body and how people react. So I think this is a tip for all interviews. Have a list of tips for yourself that you review before you go into the interview. If it's that you need to slow down, write down, tip number 1, slow down. If you need to smile, write down tip number 2, smile, and have that list that you can remind yourself immediately before the interview begins, so that you know that these are issues that you should be aware of.
Did we all smile when Michael said smile? I did. I definitely did. That's some sociology or psychology there that Liz might know more about than me. We have a question from a younger alumni, more about graduate school. Any thoughts there, and how do you think about interviewing for graduate school, law school, things like that right now?
I don't know if I am qualified to answer this because I dropped out of a sociology PhD program.
Where were you studying?
I think UW-Madison.
Nice.
It's a great program. I just wasn't sure it was for me. So I can't speak directly to interviewing for graduate schools right now, but I know a lot of the same things will probably apply. If you have research assistantships or references from professors, I think traditionally, like, I didn't interview with anyone until I was admitted to my PhD program. So I think some things might be largely the same, but that's a conjecture.
That's more than I know. I graduated business school a decade ago, so I can't really remember it. I just remember that Stanford had a really good essay question, but I didn't get in. So, Marge, there was a question that I think you might be interested to answer. It was about hands.
Sure.
Hands on Zoom.
Yeah, hands on Zoom.
Do we use them? Do we not use them? I'm half Italian American, so like I want to use them, but like, is that distracting?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid to show your personality as much as you can. Of course, obviously do what's appropriate, use your judgment. But I think if it's going to make you feel relaxed and help you express yourself, what I like to see is candidates who kind of tell a story as they talk about. They don't just walk through each job or each role that they've had. Sort of tell a story about why you made the career choices you did. And with that, it's a little bit more kind of relaxing, and it answers the pacing question also, hopefully, where you're telling a story, you're a little bit more relaxed, and you're using your hands to kind of convey and express kind of the journey. So I'm all for using whatever expressions help you get your point across, and your personality. Show your personality.
Do we have any dissenting opinions?
I wouldn't say dissenting, I'm more agreeing. I would say that when I'm an interviewer, my goal is to enter into a conversation with someone, and I want to see what they are really like. So if you are normally a person who talks with your hands, please talk with your hands, at least when you're being interviewed by me. If you're not, don't feel like I'm going to interpret the fact that you're sitting still negatively. If that's who you are, then be who you are.
So that actually raises a pretty interesting point of like, is it that different interviewing on Zoom? Like, what should we, like, it's just basically going into an interview, any interview. What should we be thinking about? How do we prepare for that?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the list. What are the tips that you have to remind yourself before going into you go into the interview? For people who are just beginning their careers, know what's on your resume and be able to be prepared to talk about what's on your resume. I've run into so many instances where people seem shocked that they get a question about something on their resume. These are just normal tips that you would have for any sort of interview situation.
No, and I think that's important for us to spend some time there, because interviewing, I always compare interviewing to democracy, right? Like it's a terrible system, but it's the best one we've found so far, right? It's super hard. It's super stressful. And I think that lots of people, forget or don't even think about the basics. Even me, I'm actually a pretty good interviewer, and I've done it a lot, and I've interviewed lots of people, but it's super stressful when I go in to actually be judged by someone else or be trying to win this contest. Any thoughts in general, just about not online interviewing, but just interviewing in general?
I have one thing to add on that note. So I have interviewed, but I've also interviewed people in my new role. And it can be helpful to remember, like when I'm interviewing someone, I want this to work out. I hope and wish that they're the ideal candidate and that they will join my firm. So try to remember that the interviewer and yourself have the same objectives. They're not heavily scrutinizing you. I think everyone, it's expensive and tedious to like search for months to fill an open role. So like, if that can make it easier, and I think that's like generally true also off Zoom, that like you and the interviewer have like objectives that are aligned. So like you both want this to go well.
So Liz, on that, is there anything that you've learned as an interviewee that you're now implementing as an interviewer?
Definitely. So I'm glad you asked that question. In my industry, there are on-site interviews that tend to be like 6 hours long. As an interviewer, you might only be interviewing someone for an hour. As an interviewee, you might have a 6-hour block of different Zoom rooms you're joining. So I think it is nice to give people like a 5-minute window in between interviewers so they can attend to physiological needs, because I did do an interview where I didn't drink any water for like 4 hours and it was a weird experience. So like this is both a reminder to interviewers and interviewees to take breaks as needed.
So that's a great point. The people aren't good at interviewing on both sides, right? Like I've managed so many teams of interviewers, and it's a hard thing. And like, yeah, they don't think about it. They come in for that 30 minutes or that hour, and they don't know. They don't even know if you've had a bio break or not, right? So that's a great point.
I will add that as a Zoom comment, I think we at least have been more willing to do more interviews through Zoom, thinking that first of all, we can just squeeze more Zoom interviews into our schedule now, but also the cost for the interviewee seems to be lower. They don't have to get dressed up and come into our offices or whatever. So we tend to pack in more interviews than probably we did before we did before the time of COVID. So it is very easy to forget about things like bio breaks and whatnot. So it's a good point. Yeah,
no, it's like it's hard and all. Like 2020 has been a year, right? It's been hard on all sides. We have some interesting questions coming in. I'm just going to go to them because they're the questions from the audience are probably better than what we could think of. Any thoughts about standing desk? Is it better to be in a standing desk when you interview? I'm not in a standing desk right now.
I'm not at a standing desk right now, but I find I talk better when I'm standing up. Particularly, I mentioned that one of my interviews was a group interview where it was a Zoom of 10 people who were interviewing me at the same time. And it becomes more like a presentation if I'm standing up, which is
so
something
you're like on stage.
Yes. And so I do like talking in general and presenting standing as opposed to sitting. I'm sitting right now, but I like that.
I think that's a great point. Like there's an energy that's different, right, when you're standing.
Yeah.
And it's okay to think about the different. This is actually a great point around this whole interview process. You use different like parts of yourself in different physical settings, right? So standing is, yeah, that's cool.
And I tend to use my hands more when I'm standing as well.
For sure. Marge, we had a question for you and the whole team around organizational culture, and how do you sort of figure out the feel of an organization without being there? Like when I worked at Instacart, when you walk into the building, you know where you are. When I worked at Uber, you walked in, you feel the energy. How do you do that over Zoom?
Yeah, that's a great point. I know I mentioned that earlier, answer to a previous question. I would say definitely you need to research even more in advance. Go to Glassdoor, talk to fellow colleagues, tap your network, just to get the kind of first insights. And then, just ask those questions. What is the work dynamic like? Are we sharing desks? Do people have cubicles? Although this is probably all going to change after the pandemic, the way offices are configured. I think you just have to be a little bit more direct with some of the questions. And I think everyone's pretty forgiving given the current situation. So they'll be willing to share, what it's like and provide a description. So those kinds of things. So I hope that answers the question. I mean, there are other things too, like I think it goes both ways. As an interviewer, you want to know if the candidate is a good cultural fit. And there are those types of questions as well, which is a little bit more different than environmental, which we can get into later. But I think from a candidate standpoint, just you can be direct and just ask, what's the work dynamic like? What's the team like? What's the collaboration? What kind of collaboration tools do you use online? I think once you ask these questions and you get deeper and deeper, you'll probably get a sense from the answers.
Nice. It's hard. It's hard, right? I've said for years, when I worked at Apple a decade ago, more than a decade ago now, everyone wanted to work at Apple. And I would tell them, like, do you actually know what it's like? Like, it's not fun. It's hard. Like, you got people yelling at you like Steve Jobs, like it's going to be a hard place to work, and you're not going to do anything creative because there's one guy that does all the creative stuff. So I think company culture is something that people forget about or don't think enough about. Like what is the culture you want to work in? Where we'd be happy every day when you go to work, right? So I think that's a really good point.
Definitely. I'm glad you brought up that example, Michael, because I interviewed at Amazon a while back, and they had told me from examples that if you get an email from Jeff Bezos, that means you got to drop everything and do it. So that gives you a sense of
like Sunday afternoon,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Oh, I know. I was riding a motorcycle with a buddy of mine who was still at Apple at the time in the peninsula in the Bay Area. And it was Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and he got an email from Tim Cook, and our ride got shortened. So yeah, that's a really good point. It's when I actually taught I helped Mike Gibbs, Chicago booth professor, teach a class. It was 3 years ago now, I think. And his case study for that class was on Amazon's culture. The New York Times had done like a takedown, basically, article of Amazon, right? And it was like one-sided, but still interesting. I was teaching on a Wednesday. On the Sunday before, the New York Times published an article about Uber's culture. And I was a director at Uber at that point. And Mike texted me or emailed me. He's like, if you don't want to come, it's okay. And I was like, no, this is the University of Chicago. We're used to hard questions, and we'll do it. We've had a lot of great questions coming through. One is around, that's come up a few times, is around backgrounds. Do we use a virtual background? Do we not use a virtual background? How do we deal with that? When we talked before about like, what do you have, a pet or a child or a spouse or someone else, like, how do you deal with that?
So I'll share an interesting story that I had with, I was interviewing someone who had a background of a stadium, and I didn't recognize the stadium. So I asked about it, and it turned out it was a stadium in Turkey. And it began a conversation about his experience as a refugee from Turkey and coming to the United States. So having that virtual background in his case was very helpful and engaged, and let me connect with him on a very personal basis and have a reason for him to share his story. So it was great. I've also seen some very bad backgrounds, virtual backgrounds, which, blowing palm trees can be distracting. If you don't have a connection to the Golden Gate Bridge, I wonder why you have it in the background. Those kinds of things also, though.
The Golden Gate Bridge is about 2 miles that way. So I'm good, right?
Yes, you're perfect.
I think Michael raises a great point. Like when choosing a background or not choosing a background, it's like another way to inject your personality or like something of yourself into the interview process that is not available to you in in-person interviewing. So like as much as some aspects of Zoom interviewing are challenging or they feel negative, like other aspects of the medium are like opportunities. I do not use a Zoom background. And I did most of my interviews from my kitchen, and that led to a lot of kind of interesting and light conversations about like my love of cooking and that I have an Instant Pot. So you have like a lot more control in the image you're projecting, the fact that you can use a Zoom background or not.
Right. So you have there's actually some advantages to this current situation we're all in. We've had a few questions around compensation. I've been doing this for almost 20 years and I still don't have good answers here. So hoping that one of you will. How do you even think about comp? How do you talk about that? How do you, in the pandemic, like it seems like there's more downward pressure on salaries. How do you work that role?
I am fairly new to negotiating and probably not that good at it. But if you are able to secure multiple offers, I think that's a way to exert a competitive upward pressure on the wages you can command.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Software engineering is more demand, right? So it's definitely helpful. I think that's there's also a lot of data, right? And that's another point. I think regardless of the role, like figure out what the actual market range is, right? And you should get the market range, not the range they give to you. You should get whatever's fair, right? And there's obviously so much tied up in that idea. But I think Marge, it looks like you have some thoughts here too.
No, I would agree with what Liz said and what you just said as well. Just researching ahead of time and kind of knowing we were taught in negotiation class, just knowing your bottom line. What is that bottom line price that and maybe you don't share that, but have a range that you can work with. And there's just different takes on this. I like to make sure they name a number first. I don't want to be the first one to name a number. And if it gets uncomfortable, just say you want to, just give a range, I would say. Based on my research, here is what I see as what I'm comfortable with. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did negotiations at Chicago booth, but I think I got a C in that class. So I'm Liz. I'm also not a very good negotiator. But yeah, you don't want to put your number out first. You want to see what they're willing to pay, and then you can always adjust from there, right? Random question, which I think was pretty good from Ruth. what color clothes to wear?
Something that doesn't conflict with your background. Makes you stand out.
That's a good answer.
I totally agree with Michael.
I'm normally a white shirt person, and I find that white shirts don't translate as much or as well on Zoom. So I usually go for color when I'm on Zoom.
Well, the blue looks nice.
Well, thank you.
So many good questions coming. Moving from a low-cost area of living to a high-cost area of living. People are moving in the pandemic, apparently. Thoughts on how do you negotiate or how do you navigate the compensation question there? Liz, you kind of moved. I mean, Chicago's not super low cost, but you made that kind of move, right?
Yes, definitely. So I think it's important to make like a relocation package a part of your negotiation, if that's possible for you. I know that it can be hard to move from like a more affordable city like Chicago to a place like San Francisco. So like a lot of companies, especially bigger ones, will give you either a lump sum or a relocation package. And it's a big financial decision. So you should sit down and like work out all the figures to determine which option would be most advantageous to you, if that's available to you.
Any other ideas? If not, then there's so many good questions coming in. Salary expectations. Oh, how about interviewing the interviewer? What questions should you have for the interviewer, and how do you think about creating those questions?
Number one, always have questions. I've certainly interviewed people who have no questions, and it's always a awkward moment because it indicates to me, well, I wonder about a person's true interest if they don't have questions. Even if they've had questions going along throughout the interview, I think you should have questions when you reach that point. So if you're afraid that some of your questions might be answered during the course of the interview, add a few more so that you can have questions at the end. But the kinds of questions that I find that are good are things that share something about the interviewee. So if you're seeking information about the culture, for example, I'm going to take that away as culture is important to that person, and it'll cause me to ask, how do I think they fit into our culture, which is often a good thing.
So one thing you said there, which really resonated, is the idea that this engagement of the interviewer. I think sometimes people go into an interview and they're just answering questions, right? Instead of like, what you really want to be is like, it's a conversation. You want to change it. And even if the other two, I think Marge's point earlier, like the interviewer is probably not a great person. They've only done this 50 times or less than 50 times, right? They're not good at it. But you want to make it easy for them too. So you create a conversation, you create this back and forth, and that's great. And even if you don't get the job, at least it was a nice chat, right? So I think there's something to be said for that. And then the culture bit is really important. Does anyone have any thoughts on, like, how do you understand a company culture, and how do you know if you're right for it?
It's understanding yourself, what's important to you. If it's being yourself, if you are a person who has piercings and you like to wear piercings to work, and then understanding that, I think so many times diversity and equity and inclusion are important points for so many. Understanding where an organization stands on those issues, that can be important. I think most organizations now are used to direct questions along those lines, so it's not something that you have to avoid anymore. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I'm not sure that was the case, but I think most places now are used to those kinds of questions, or at least know how to answer those kind of questions. Figure out what's important to you and see if the culture matches.
Yeah, I think there's, as you do your research, there's also some clues you can pick up on the company. Like a friend of mine who's a CEO of a consumer products company, she's looking for her next role, and she looks at the management team and the board, and if it's all male, for example, she says, that's a clue right there. So probably not as appealing to her. So there's things like that. Just from, you get a feel from their social media. The social media tells you a lot about what they post, visually as well as the copy. I mean, you get a really strong feel for that just from there. And talk to friends if you just tap your network, get a feel, ask for informational interviews, just to get a feel for what the culture is really like. Like if they've gone through a lot of changes, for example, management changes, that's an indicator there as well. I work for startups who've gone through many transformations. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. So those are just some clues to be aware of, or some avenues you can pursue.
It's a really important point, I think, that and we talked about it earlier, but the culture, and Michael, what you said about understanding yourself, and we're probably all still working on that, but understanding yourself and then figuring out if you really want to be at that place, if it really fits you, is important. Your job is, yes, one, you got to make money, so you're making the money from the job, but if you go one level higher, your satisfaction and your sort of your rewards that you get from the day-to-day work are important. And I've been in situations where I've worked at companies where I just did not fit the culture, and I slogged through it, but I wasn't happy, and eventually I left. Right, so even if those were more high-paying jobs. So I think just understanding and thinking about cultures, I think people don't think about it enough. We have a great question about career breaks. How do you address that? If you've taken 4 years off, 10 years off, to be a parent, to be a caregiver, to whatever, what do we think about that?
This is just my impression, and I'm fairly early stage career, so maybe it was looked upon more kindly in my case. But after I left my PhD program, I took like a year to ride my bike and program, and worked very menial jobs. No one was judgmental of it. I think maybe in the past, there was more of an expectation of a long continuous streak of service for a company without breaks, but I just think the nature of work has changed and become more fragmented over time. So I think if you can be honest and sort of say what things you did during that time period that were value add, like I learned C++, I rode my bike, I took care of a relative. I would never begrudge someone for taking a career break. And so I think as long as you can sort of say what value added activities you did during that time, that's fine.
Where did you ride?
Up and down the Lakefront Trail in Chicago a lot of times.
Nice. I think that's true. I think I don't know enough about the rest of the country, but in Silicon Valley, for sure, we don't mind people taking a year or two off. Like it's like you go crazy for a couple of years, you build something, and then you take time off. But I do think it's a good question, and a good question to have a good answer to, right? Here's a good one from Jason Simpson. Question for any panelists: what is the biggest mistake you've made in an interview, And what would you do now to prevent it from happening again? And no vulnerability hangovers, please, but if you're willing to share.
I am okay with sharing this. I interviewed at a cryptocurrency exchange. It was my first on-site. They typically ask kind of these challenging algorithmic questions. And I just freaked out. And I was like, I'm sorry, I have to go. And I closed the screen. I do not recommend that to anyone. That happened one time. It's fine. It wasn't really a good fit for me, but I did learn a lot from that experience. Like, unfortunately, the Zoom experience means you can just close the screen, which is not possible in a real interview. And after that, I did a lot more practice. So that was definitely a mistake, but not a very serious one in the grand scheme of things. So learn from my errors and do not do that yourself.
How did that feel? Like that sounds like almost traumatic. Like, how did that feel to like just walk away?
It was
Not even walk, I guess.
It was, I guess, not ideal, but at the same time, I had a lot of interviews scheduled. So I was like, all right, next time I'm just going, like, I formulated a plan for the next time because Ruby doesn't have certain like inbuilt data structures. And I was like, totally unprepared for that.
Wow. Lots of good questions. We're in the Q&A period officially now, even though we've been doing it for a while. If you're stereotyping your position, questions specifically around executive MBAs. I have an executive MBA from the University of Chicago, so maybe I'm qualified to answer this, but when you're sort of stuck in a role, how do you actually make a career transition, like a total change to do something new?
I can offer a thought or opinion on that. Volunteer for the role that you want to be. Particularly easy in the legal field. If you're in a legal practice area that you want to change, I almost guarantee you that there is a volunteer opportunity in the practice area that you'd like to go to. Put in a plug for the legal aid community out there. Legal aid covers a wide variety, not just smaller items. They cover every practice area. So if you can volunteer and show that you have true depth and interest in that area, I think it goes a long way to at least getting your foot in the door or getting that first interview.
And Michael, is that something you did for your career pivots?
As I mentioned, my current role developed out of me increasing my level of pro bono activity. So yeah, in some ways, that is the story.
Brilliant. That's great. That's great. Other ideas? It's a hard one. And I may or may not be in a career transition myself right now. It's hard after 20 years of doing one thing to figure out how to do another thing. And we get very stuck and siloed into a category of what we do. And to try to do something completely different is it's not easy. It takes some guts. But also all interviews, all jobs, like I've told people for years, like changing jobs is super hard. It's happening more with the younger generation now, like the frequency is more, but it's a super hard thing. Like it's one of the hardest things you ever do. So if you're on this call and you're feeling like stressed or frustrated or whatever else, like that's normal. It's hard. Couple last questions before we're going to wrap up. Let's see. What if the if the candidate doesn't want to turn on their camera? What do you think about that?
have never had it happen. I would, we talked about trust earlier. I think it would be hard to build trust without visually seeing an individual, or at least understanding why someone didn't want to be visually seen.
But if I push back on that, like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we would just be on the phone.
Yeah.
I love the phone. Like the phone, it's this thing that you can put in your hand and put in your ear. Most people don't know about these days, but I actually find I pay better attention not having video on.
And I love phone interviews too. I've done quite a few over the years. But if the forum is video, I begin to wonder why someone wouldn't want to do the video.
I've gotten a notice that we have time for one more question. Wow, this is one I didn't know. Actually, this is a good one. Recording, and obviously this call is being recorded for those states that need to have that disclosure. But how do we push back on not to record? Many HR are recording the interview. I did not know about that. Have you, any of you experienced that? I have not experienced that at all. That seems, well, I'll hold my opinion.
I have not experienced it.
I'm just gonna say it sounds weird. I don't know. It seems weird to me. I'm just gonna give my professional opinion.
Yeah. Does that cast a negative light on the culture if they just record without your permission?
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's a lot going on there, right? Why would you need to record the interview, right? So yeah, maybe don't work there. I think we're about there. I hope this was valuable for everybody. Sam is going to come back on and give us some closing tips from the Mansueto Library. We've loved to share with all of you this hour.
Thank you all so much. This was really insightful and really fun for me to listen in on. I am so grateful for your advice. Just a few closing remarks from me. I'd love for anyone on the line to join us for our next workshop in the Career Month series happening tomorrow. And it's all about building your LinkedIn network. No matter where you are in your career, you'll leave our hour tomorrow with meaningful updates to your LinkedIn presence. Could be particularly relevant if you're job searching right now. And then you'll see a link to a survey at the close of this meeting. Please share your feedback. I also am excited to share all of your kudos for our presenters. And that leads me to the final item is thanking Michael, Marge, and Liz for sharing all of your insights with folks on the line. We're so grateful for your time today.